Here's Clark. Wow! You bet! From beyond the logo!
A last-second touchdown, a boundary that silences the entire stadium. Lando Norris helpless, watching his race end against a concrete wall. Every sport has that one moment, the moment the world stops scrolling and actually watches. The WNBA found its moment. Caitlin Clark walked onto that court, and within months, arenas that once echoed with empty seats started turning people away at the door. Broadcasters who never once mentioned this league were suddenly cutting live to cover it. But here's the part nobody's talking about. Getting the spotlight is one thing, and standing in it without blinking? That's a completely different test. And right now, the WNBA is failing parts of that test quietly and in plain sight. Stay with us. We're about to reveal the truth. The numbers aren't showing you. One girl, one season, one shift. There's a number that the WNBA doesn't like to talk about too loudly. 18.9 million. That's how many people watched the NCAA championship game in April 2024, the game where Caitlin Clark and Iowa faced South Carolina.
Caitlin Clark and Iowa going up against the South Carolina Machine.
It was the most watched women's college basketball game ever recorded in American history. More viewers than most NBA playoff games that same year. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a basketball player at that point. She was a phenomenon. Remember, she had broken Pete Maravich's all-time NCAA scoring record, a record that had stood for 54 years. She did it not with brute strength or pure athleticism, but with a playing style that felt almost theatrical. Logo threes, no-look passes, full-court assists that made defenders look like they were standing still, and the audiences felt it. College arenas that normally held polite crowds of a few thousand were suddenly selling out weeks in advance when Iowa came to town. Road games became home games for Clark. People drove hours just to say they were there.
Iowa's Caitlin Clark has become a national phenom, and some fans say they went the extra mile just to watch her play here.
So when she entered the WNBA draft in 2024, the expectation wasn't just high, it was historic. The Indiana Fever selected her first overall. And from that moment, something shifted inside the league that nobody was fully prepared for. Her first WNBA preseason game drew more viewers than any regular season game the league had put on TV in years. Road games featuring the Fever started selling out venues that had never sold out before. Cities that hadn't cared about women's basketball in a decade were suddenly buying tickets 2 months in advance.
Indiana Fever fans were hyped after the Game 4 win, and some fans are ready to hit the slots in Las Vegas for Game 5.
The Seattle Storm, the Chicago Sky, the Atlanta Dream. All of them saw record attendance when Indiana came to play. But here's the part that gets interesting and uncomfortable. The WNBA had been building toward growth for years. Slowly, steadily, methodically. And then Caitlin Clark arrived. And what was supposed to be a 5-year plan suddenly happened in 5 months. The league didn't plan for that. No league ever does. Now here's what most people miss when they talk about Clark's impact. The conversation almost always stays on the surface. Bigger crowds, better ratings, more money coming in. But what actually changed wasn't just the numbers. It was the weight behind them. Before Clark, the WNBA could afford to be imperfect without anyone noticing. A poorly handled situation here. We're in a confusing decision there. When the audience is small, the margin for error is wide. But a player like Clark doesn't just bring fans, she brings scrutiny. Every game featuring the Indiana Fever in 2024 was being watched not just by new casual fans, but by sports journalists, TV executives, brand managers, and former athletes who had never paid attention to the league before. All of them are forming first impressions at the same time. That's a different kind of pressure. And it's a pressure the league had never experienced at this scale. Think about what that actually means for an organization. Your systems were built for a smaller stage. Your response times, your communications team, your officiating protocols, your disciplinary processes, all designed for a league that operated quietly, without much outside interference. And then, almost overnight, everything you do is being measured against the NFL, the NBA, and are in every other major sports league that has had decades to refine its operations. The bar moved before the league had a chance to prepare for it. There's a term used in business called a growth trap. It's the moment when success arrives faster than capability. Companies that fall into a growth trap don't fail because they weren't talented or because the product wasn't good. They fail because the speed of their expansion outpaced the strength of their foundation. The WNBA walked straight into a growth trap in 2024. Not because Caitlin Clark was a problem. She was and continues to be the best thing that happened to this league in a generation.
A deep first! Triple-double for a rookie. Caitlin Clark has it!
But because the league's internal structure simply wasn't designed to handle what she brought with her. Sold out, but something felt wrong. For a league that spent 2 decades begging for attention, the summer of 2024 should have felt like a celebration. And on the surface, it did. Attendance was up 48% across the entire league compared to the previous year. That's not a small jump, that's nearly half again as many bodies and seats. National TV ratings for Fever games were pulling numbers that networks hadn't seen for women's basketball since the late 1990s. Merchandise sales climbed. Social media engagement exploded. The WNBA app had record downloads. By every traditional measurement, this was the best season the league had ever had. But inside arenas, something else was happening. Fans who had followed the league for years, the ones who showed up when nobody else was watching, started feeling like strangers at their own party. The energy was electric, but it was a different kind of energy. It felt less like a basketball crowd and more like a concert crowd that happened to be sitting courtside.
Caitlin has brought and inspired a love of the basketball game that has drawn my dad and I closer together.
That tension between old fans and new fans, between the league's identity and its new audience, started bleeding into everything. Social media became a battleground. Old fans felt their league was being taken over by people who only showed up because of one player. The infrastructure wasn't ready. The staffing wasn't ready. The communication systems weren't ready. And one specific area made all of that painfully obvious: security. At multiple games during the 2024 season, incidents involving Caitlin Clark drew national attention. Hard fouls, on-court confrontations, moments that, in a different context, might have resulted in immediate ejections or fines. The league's response was slow, inconsistent, and in some cases, publicly confusing. Different players received different punishments for similar actions. Press releases were vague. Explanations felt reactive rather than proactive, and the audience, now much larger and much more vocal than before, noticed every single inconsistency. Growth had arrived. Accountability came with it. The price of being relevant. Here's something that sounds strange until you sit with it for a moment. Small leagues don't get criticized the way big leagues do. When a league is niche, when it's playing to small crowds and getting minimal media coverage, mistakes are forgiven quickly. Nobody is watching closely enough to hold them accountable. The press doesn't chase the story. The fans don't have the platform to amplify the problem. But the moment a league becomes relevant, everything changes. Every decision gets analyzed. Every statement gets dissected. Every silence gets interpreted. The WNBA learned this in real time during the 2024 season. There was a moment widely circulated on social media where a hard foul was committed against Caitlin Clark during a game.
Finds Boston. Clark gets hit in the face by Carrington and is down.
The play was flagrant by most reasonable definitions. The league fined the player involved $1,000. $1,000. For context, the NBA fined players $35,000 for throwing a mouthguard into the stands the same year. And the financial gap between the two leagues is enormous, so a direct comparison isn't entirely fair. But the optics were brutal. Sports media picked it up immediately. Twitter, or X, whatever we're calling it now, turned it into a 3-day conversation. ESPN had panel debates. Former players weighed in. Fans who had only recently discovered the league were already forming opinions about whether it was being run properly. That's the price of relevance. When nobody's watching, you can make quiet mistakes. When everybody's watching, even a small misstep becomes a case study in how not to run a league. There's a concept in organizational behavior called scale shock. It's the moment when a company or institution grows so fast that its internal systems can't keep up with its external reputation. The outside world sees success. The inside is barely holding the pieces together. Scale shock is exactly what the WNBA was experiencing. And scale shock always comes with a warning: fix the systems now while you still have goodwill, or watch the goodwill drain away when the problems pile up. The pay fight nobody saw coming. In February 2025, the WNBA and its players began negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement, the contract that determines how much players get paid, what their working conditions look like, and how revenue gets shared between the league and its athletes. The timing was not a coincidence. For years, high WNBA player salaries had been a quiet source of frustration within the sport. The maximum salary for a WNBA player in 2024 was around $241,000. In the NBA, the minimum salary for a rookie, a player who might never see significant court time, was over $1 million.
It's a sharp contrast to last year's top 3 picks in the NBA rookie class, who averaged around $10 million a year.
Now, the gap between men's and women's professional sports salaries is a complex issue with many factors involved. Revenue, attendance history, television deals. Audio sponsorship structures, none of it is as simple as pay women more. The financial reality of running a sports league is genuinely complicated. But here's what changed in 2024. The revenue argument started to collapse. When Caitlin Clark games were pulling television ratings that rivaled mid-level NBA playoff matchups, the old talking point of women's sports don't generate enough revenue to justify higher salaries became much harder to defend. Sponsors noticed. Brands that had never considered WNBA partnerships were suddenly in conversations. Amazon Prime Video signed a deal to broadcast WNBA games. CBS renewed its agreement. Apple TV added coverage. The money was moving, and the players knew it. The CBA negotiations in 2025 became the most watched and most discussed labor talks in the league's history.
Negotiations are going to be ongoing probably throughout the weekend, possibly beyond.
Players were more unified than they had ever been. This is where the situation got delicate, because the WNBA wasn't just negotiating a contract, when it was negotiating its own identity at the worst possible moment to get it wrong. Think about who was watching these talks. Not just players and team owners, casual fans, millions of them who had discovered the league in 2024 and were still in that early stage where their loyalty wasn't locked in yet. New sponsors who were evaluating whether the league was stable enough for a long-term investment. So broadcast partners who had just committed real money and needed to see the product remain reliable. All of them were reading the same headlines. All of them were forming opinions. And the core issue at the center of the CBA talks wasn't just salary numbers. It was a deeper question about what the WNBA actually believed its players were worth now that the evidence had shifted. That same year, she was appearing in national commercials, headlining marketing campaigns, and selling out arenas across the country. Her name was attached to real revenue, yet her salary was still capped at a number that many mid-level corporate managers in America earn without playing a single minute of professional sport. That disconnect became impossible to ignore once the league's financials started moving in a new direction. The players weren't just asking for more money, they were asking the league to acknowledge what the numbers already showed, that the product had changed, that the audience had grown, and that the old financial framework was built for a version of the WNBA that no longer existed. On the other side, the league's ownership had its own pressures. Several WNBA franchises still operated at a financial loss. The league as a whole had spent years being subsidized by the NBA. Rapid salary increases without matching revenue guarantees carried real financial risk, especially for smaller market teams that hadn't benefited from the 2024 surge as directly as the Indiana Fever had. Neither side was entirely wrong. That's what made the negotiation genuinely hard. The danger in any labor negotiation is that both sides dig in. The goodwill erodes, and the fans, the ones who just discovered the league and are still deciding whether to stay quietly, walk away while the adults argue about money. The 2004 to 2005 NHL lockout canceled an entire season. Both leagues survived, but survival and momentum are very different things. What happens next decides everything. History has a pattern that it runs on repeat, and sports leagues are no exception to it. The NBA in the 1970s was a mess. Games weren't always on national television. Finals games were broadcast on tape delay, meaning people watched the championship outcome hours after it happened. The league had an image problem, a drug problem, and an attendance problem. Well, nobody was sure it would survive the decade. Then Magic Johnson and Larry Bird arrived in 1979, and then Michael Jordan in 1984. And slowly, not immediately, but steadily, the league rebuilt itself into the global powerhouse it is today. The NFL's path wasn't smooth either. For most of the mid-20th century, baseball was America's sport. Football was regional, rough, and secondary. It took decades of strategic broadcasting decisions, rule changes designed to make the game more exciting, and a deliberate effort to make the Super Bowl a cultural event rather than just a football game. These things don't happen by accident. They happen because organizations make deliberate choices at critical moments and then execute on those choices consistently over a long period of time. The WNBA is at one of those critical moments right now. First, transparency. The league needs to communicate better. When incidents happen on the court, the explanation of what action was taken and why needs to be fast, clear, and consistent. Second, investment in infrastructure. The arenas, the staffing, the broadcast quality, and the officiating all need to match the level of attention the league is now receiving. Third, the CBA needs to get done. Not perfectly, not everyone is happy, but it needs to reach a resolution that both sides can live with, and it needs to happen without a work stoppage. Fourth, and this is the one nobody talks about, the league needs to build stars beyond Caitlin Clark. Right now, the WNBA has a Caitlin Clark problem, not because she's a problem. She's the best thing that's happened to this league in 20 years. But because the league's growth is still disproportionately attached to one player's presence. What happens when she gets injured? What happens during a stretch when she's not playing well? Already arguably the best player in the league to have the name recognition she deserves.
We talk about how they're the #1 scoring team in the league. They have the 4th best efficiency on the defensive end as well as A'ja Wilson.
It needs Paige Buchers to develop her own following. A league built on one person's shoulders isn't built at all. Turn on the thing nobody's saying out loud. There's a conversation happening just below the surface of all the positive headlines in locker rooms, in league offices, in press boxes that almost nobody is saying out loud in public. The WNBA has a race and narrative problem that growth has made more complicated, not less. The league has always been predominantly black. Roughly 70% of WNBA players have been black women for most of the league's existence. And for most of that existence, which the league received minimal mainstream media coverage, minimal broadcast deals, and minimal corporate sponsorship. Then Caitlin Clark, a white player from Iowa, arrived, and suddenly the money showed up. The cameras showed up. The sponsors showed up. That sequence of events did not go unnoticed. Some people interpreted it as simple market dynamics. Clark was a massive college star with a massive pre-existing fan base, and that fan base followed her to the pros. Other people saw something more uncomfortable, that mainstream America was finally paying attention to women's basketball only when a white face became its central star. Both of these things can be true at the same time, and that's exactly what made the conversation so difficult. Players like Breanna Stewart, A'ja Wilson, and Nneka Ogwumike had spent their careers being genuinely elite, winning championships, earning MVP awards, and representing the USA at the Olympics, and received a fraction of the media attention that Clark generated in her first few months. This isn't about blaming Caitlin Clark. She didn't create this dynamic. She didn't ask for it.
She is back! 24-18, fevered out. Caitlin now from the right wing, 30-plus feet, good again!
But the league has to address it honestly. Because if the WNBA's growth story is a story where one kind of player gets the spotlight and another kind, equally talented, equally dedicated, equally deserving, stays in the shadows, or then the foundation of that growth is unstable. A'ja Wilson's story deserves a 30-minute ESPN feature. Breanna Stewart's career deserves a documentary. Erike Ogunbowale, one of the most entertaining players in the league, deserves national commercial deals. Every league that ever became great had a moment where it could have gone either way. The NBA had it, the NFL had it, global football had it, and they all survived not because they were perfect, but because they made enough of the right choices when it mattered most. The WNBA is in that moment right now. The fans are here. The money is moving. The stars are ready. What's left is the hardest part, turning a moment into a movement. Because relevance fades fast when it isn't backed by substance. And the league that fought so hard for the world's attention cannot afford to waste it now that it finally has it. Growth was never the finish line. This is. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the WNBA is handling this right? We cover the stories behind the stories every single week.